I'm pleased to be here today for a talk at Google with Mr. Robin Hanson. Robin is a research associate at the Future of Humanity Institute at Oxford University and an associate professor of economics at George Mason University. He's known for his ideas on idea futures and markets and was involved in the creation of DARPA's FutureMAP project and the Foresight Institute's Foresight Exchange. He invented market scoring rules like the LMSR used by prediction markets such as Consensus Point, where he is the chief scientist, and has conducted research on signaling. Hanson's blog, Overcoming Bias, has more than 50,000 visitors per month with more than 8 million views since 2005. Robin, thanks so much for joining us, and welcome.
Thank you. I plan to leave lots of time for questions, but feel free to ask questions along the way, and I'll feel free to say later. Deal? All right. This is a big picture. This is the US economy over the last 4 years. A few days ago, that last bar came out. It's always big news. The economy bumps up or down a little bit. But we're going to be talking about a bigger picture. This is the world economy over the last half century or so. And now on the y-axis, it's a logarithm of the size of the world economy. And as you know, logarithms make exponentials look like lines, and that's roughly a line. So the major news over the last half century or so is the world economy has been slowly doubling roughly every 15 years. But if you go back even farther, say 2,000 years, it's still a log axis, but it's no longer a line because it was not exponential growth. There was the famous Industrial Revolution. Before that, it looks like there wasn't growth, and then we've been growing like gangbusters ever since. But if you look back even farther, over 10,000 years, you'll see that there was a farming revolution 7,000 years or so ago, and it was growing exponential after that. During the farming era, it was doubling roughly every 1,000 years. And before then, it looks like it was growing even slower, but of course, it was in fact growing exponentially roughly. It was growing even slower. And if you go back even farther, you'll see that brains were growing roughly exponentially over the last 500 million years. And even farther back, genome seems to have been growing exponentially over many billions of years. If you just look at the last period of human history, you'll see that this sequence of growth is fit pretty well by just a sequence of exponential modes, i.e. exponential growth with sudden transitions to faster growth modes. So if we put this all on one graph, now it's again logarithm, but now it's logarithm of the growth rate. And on the y-axis now I've changed it to be a logarithm of time until sometime in the near future, so I can fit this all on here. And so then you have very slowly growing things like animal brains, humans growing, doubling roughly every 250,000 years, farmers doubling roughly every 1,000, industry doubling roughly every 15. If this trend were to continue, then the statistics of the last few modes suggest roughly there would be a transition sometime roughly in the next century or so, not very precise. Within a 5-year period, the economy would go from doubling every 15 years like it does now to doubling every month or faster. And then that would last for a year or two, and then something else would happen. What could possibly cause such a thing? One of the most common speculations about a really big disruptive change on the horizon that could change everything is smart robots, artificial intelligence. And there are several stories about how that might be possible. One route is that we continue to do what we've been doing for 70 years, slowly accumulating better software. I used to be an AI researcher for 9 years, a while ago. And so when I go to conferences and I meet researchers who have been in a field for at least 20 years and ask them in your subfield that you know best, how far have we come in the last 20 years as a percentage of the distance to human level abilities, they usually say 5 to 10%. No noticeable acceleration. At that rate, we're talking 2 to 4 centuries, which is a short time, but not in your lifetime necessarily. Other people say, you know, past progress is no indication of future progress. We've got a really great theory just around the corner, and when we do, everything will be easy. Maybe. I'm going to explore a third scenario, a relatively conservative scenario. This is the idea, of course, as you know, porting software. We're going to try to port the software that's already in the human brain. To do that, we need 3 things. We're going to need lots of fast parallel computers, which we don't have enough of yet. We don't have any of these things yet, but we're working on it. We need to have the ability to take particular human brains and scan them in very fine spatial and chemical detail. And then we need to have models of how each type of brain cell works in terms of taking input signals, changing internal state, and sending output signals. If you have all of those things, then you can basically take a particular scan and make a model of that particular brain with your models of all the particular brain cell types. And if your models are good enough, your scan's good enough, the entire thing should have the same input-output behavior, i.e. you could hook it up with hands, eyes, ears, mouths, and talk to it, talk back, ask it to do things, it might do them. If you had that sort of thing and it was cheap, a lot changes. Now, when might that happen? It depends on how deep into the brain structure we go. The brain cells are very complicated. If we have to do a lot of that complexity, it'll take longer before we have computers that are cheap enough to do that. If not, we can do it sooner, but still the forecast is roughly in the next century or so. That's roughly the time scale. Now, I've been around people, some of them in this room, for 30 or more years who like to talk about this subject. It's a favorite bull session topic for college students. When the subject comes up, the favorite topics are usually, is it even technically possible to make a machine that acts just like a real human? If we were to do it, is it going to be conscious, or is it just a bunch of wires? If we made a copy of me, an emulation of me, is it me or is it somebody else? Those are all really fun subjects that I'm going to ignore. I think they're overdone. You're welcome to take them on, but I want to talk about a neglected subject. So I've written this book, The Age of M, Work, Love, and Life When Robots Rule the Earth, just out June 1st, some favorable quotes. I decided to focus on what would actually happen. What would be the actual social consequences of having this technology? What does the world look like? Now, if you look up on Amazon the keyword history, you'll find about 20% of the books have the keyword history. 1% of the keyword future. A lot more interest in the past and the future. Interestingly, though, if you look at historical fiction and future fiction, it's about the same. And you might ask, well, why don't we study the future more? Because we can do something about it, maybe. Past is kind of too late. And the usual answer people give you is, well, duh, we can't study the future. We can study the facts. See all these artifacts and stuff we've got around? We can study the past because we have these artifacts. No artifacts about the future, no study. I think that's wrong. So we have theory. I'm a social scientist. So think about 3 different ways to think about the future. One is to just take current trends like increasing leisure, decreasing religiosity, increasing promiscuity, whatever it is, project those trends forward, think about where they lead. Another way to do futurism is to imagine disruptive technologies, self-driving cars, blockchains, and try to imagine the details of those technologies. But a third way of doing futurism is to take one of those disrupting technologies and ask, what are the consequences? What follows as a result? And that tends to be neglected because the people who take these disrupting technologies seriously tend to be technologists, physical scientists, and I learned when I was a graduate physical scientist that the standard view is those social scientists, they're bullshit. They don't know anything. It doesn't exist. So I became a PhD and now a professor of economics, and I can tell you it does exist. And this book is in part trying to show you that we know a lot and we can apply lots of things we know to find out answers to questions like this. So this is a map of academia. These are different major fields connected by co-citation links. When they cite each other a lot, they're linked. So academia is a circle. Go figure. I don't know why. But I can tell you that these are the fields I'm drawing on for this book. I have an unusually diverse background, so I've turned that into a virtue. It's usually not a virtue in academia to know too many fields. But I'm going to draw all that on that for this book. That allows me to take some simple strategies like pick the low-hanging fruit. I'm just going to go area by area through a civilization with this brain emulations and ask, what do standard theories predict about this? And when I find easy things to say, I say them. And when it looks hard, I go on to the next one. I am applying theory here. So I'm a theorist. I'm staking our standard theories and applying them. I'm going to do what theorists do everywhere, which is we look for our keys under the lamppost. I.e., we make simplifying assumptions as necessary to get concrete results. That's what we always do. Welcome to theory. So this is my last slide. We're going to tell you how I'm doing what I'm doing. And then after this, I'm going to start telling you all the results that I've learned about this world. But just to be clear, cover my ass. I'm an academic after all. First of all, I'm just trying to apply standard consensus, not be creative or original, other than asking this unusual question. Secondly, I'm going to focus on just saying what this world looks like, whether I like it or you like it. It's not my job to make you like it. My job is just to tell you what it looks like, whether with a path of least resistance, as if we did the least to stop it, just what it's most likely to become. Not that much happens to humans during this era. I will talk about them, but mostly the focus is on the robots because a lot happens for them. I'm not going to tell you about the entire history of the universe for the next trillion years. My ambition, which I think is pretty ambitious enough, is to tell you about the next great era after ours that's as different from our era as ours is from the farming or foraging eras that came before us. That's plenty for me, thank you very much. I'm going to focus on what happens once this world is in its groove, where people know roughly what to expect, and they can see their world. You are now in the industrial era. The industrial era has reached some sort of rough equilibrium. You know kind of what our world's like. Early on in the Industrial Revolution, people didn't know where it was going. They were scared, and it was a lot harder to predict what was happening during a transition than it is during the equilibrium. I'm going to take a standard economist method called supply and demand. This is our usual first cut analysis of everything because it's our best and easiest first cut analysis. This is basically assuming a lot of competitors and relatively little regulation. It's a world out of control. Nobody runs it. There's no vote taken on what people wish would happen. The world just happens as a result of many small local actions. Finally, these emulations, I'm going to make simple assumptions about them, which I think are more reasonable in the early era at least. You have this emulation. You made a scan, and you made a model. And you have it, and it's mostly a black box. There's a few tweaks you can make to it, but mostly you can turn it on, turn it off, copy it, erase it, run it fast, run it slow. That's about it. And now I'm going to talk about what does that world look like. We have these cheap emulations. Those are the things you can do to them. This is the assumptions I'm making. Yes? It starts out being exactly the person that was scanned. So as soon as you turn it on, you have to tell it, you are the emulation, sir, or madam, and convince it that it is no longer the human because a moment ago it was the scan of a human, and that's where it was before. So it then diverges from that point on through differing experiences to become something different in terms of its life, but it starts out being very human in terms of its psychology and its skills and its memory and habits and things like that. All right. He says, why do I so quickly dismiss the idea that this could be impossible? Well, as I said, I've heard that discussion over and over again for many decades. I'm tired of it. You can look it up. There are many people who have talked about it, but I thought so many people have talked about this scenario that it's worth thinking about what would actually happen rather than endlessly go over the philosophical underpinnings of whether it could be possible or not. Sort of a technologist sort of attitude, like, let's just get on with making the thing and see what happens.
It sounds like you're actually indifferent as to whether.
I have many personal opinions here about preferences that are irrelevant to my talk. You shouldn't care what I want. You should care what I know. And I'm going to tell you what I know. All right, so some things I can tell you are just true for any world dominated by robots because the key assumption is that a robot can be represented by some sort of computer file. So computer files can be made immortal. You can archive them, keep bringing them back. So robots can in principle be immortal. Now, today houses and cars are in principle immortal. That is, you can keep repairing them forever, but you don't always. So just because they could be immortal doesn't mean they are. Electronic files can be sent electronically across long distances. So emulations or other kinds of robots can travel long distance at the speed of light by just sending the file that represents them. You care that you don't kill nature in part because you fear that if you kill nature, you will die. It's a reasonable fear, but robots don't have that fear. They know that if they are made in factories out of stuff dug up in mines, if they accidentally kill off nature, they keep going. So they have less of an impetus to save nature. You can make copies of computer files, and that has enormous implications. So first of all, with the supply and demand of labor. Today, you guys are all in high demand. You're all very valuable. There's a big demand for people like you, a limited supply of people like you. You get high wages. Isn't that nice? When there are substitutes for you that are made in factories with a very elastic supply curve, which most stuff made in factories has, wages fall down to subsistence level of the robots, which is below subsistence level for humans. And so even if the economy gets much bigger, still wages stay small at subsistence level for robots. The economy can also grow faster. So today, we need basically labor and capital to make stuff. First approximation. We can make stuff in factories actually pretty fast. But if you make a lot more stuff in factories and you have the same number of people, you have diminishing returns. They're not actually that valuable. If you could make a lot more people fast, the economy could grow fast. But today, the economy doubles every 15 years, and we don't double people every 15 years. So what are we doing? We are making better machines. This is the main way we grow today, is through innovation. However, if you can make substitutes for people in a factory, and you can make them just as fast as you can make other stuff in factories, the economy can grow much faster than our economy goes today. Standard growth economics says it could plausibly double every month or faster. That's a straightforward prediction of standard theory. If the economy doubles every month, this whole era may only last a year or two. And during that era, if it takes a year to get to Mars, they will really not be that interested in that. The opportunity cost will be just extreme. So they will either figure out ways to get around really fast or wait for a while before they take long, slow trips. Most of you are probably software engineers. So let me tell you about software in this new era. Over the last few decades, you guys have enjoyed the experience that your wages have been slowly rising while the cost of hardware you deal with has been rapidly falling. That has changed your style of programming. That is, you are doing more and more things that are very intensive with hardware because they're cheap. However, when emulations show up, all of a sudden the cost of emulation falls dramatically. And then the cost of the emulation hardware falls at the same rate of other computer hardware, roughly. So there's a sudden back to the future moment where you go back to old styles of software engineering that were less hardware intensive, and then you stay at roughly that era for a long time, at least for parallel software. For serial hardware, it's worse. You start going backward and backward because serial hardware does not improve as fast as the hardware that emulations are made of. Yes? So the question is, do I see programming languages changing or evolving? And my generic answer here is I've looked opportunistically for things I can say with some confidence, and I say them. And when I can't find a thing to say, I don't say it. And this is one of those things I don't know what to say. What I can tell you is, if you understand how programming languages and tools depend on the ratio of the cost of hardware to the cost of a person, those things will have a back to the future moment. Other dimensions, I don't know. And that's just for parallel hardware. For serial hardware or serial tools, it gets even worse. All right, so this is your life. You start and then you end. Isn't that nice? This is a more complicated life of an emulation. An emulation can split off copies. So at the beginning of a workday, emulations plausibly will often split off a few copies who spend a few hours doing a short-term task and then end or retire. These short-term copies are much cheaper. They don't have to rest over the whole evening in order to be ready for the next workday. So if you don't need to remember the task being done very well, you just want the task done, this is very tempting. We'll talk more about how tempting. This is an opportunistic M. They make more copies whenever there's demand for that particular copy. They don't know which things will be in more demand. Sometimes there's an expanding demand, sometimes declining, and that's their life. This could be an M software engineer or other sort of designer. You initially conceive of a large system, and then once you've conceived of the subsystems, you break into copies who then pursue the design of the subsystems, and so on recursively until you have designed an entire system with the initial vision that you had. So Ems can implement much larger design visions coherently via this process of recursive design and implementation. For us, once you made a person, they're very valuable, and if you end one, then you don't get an immediate replacement. They're very expensive investments. These are very cheap, easy come, easy go. So we have many familiar systems in our world, including software, which experience something like software rot, i.e. the experience that is, as you slowly adapt them in more detail to a particular environment, they become fragile and harder to readapt to new environments. This is true for cells and species and products today, as well as software. It also seems to be true of the human mind because we start out with what's called fluid intelligence, and we end up with what's called crystallized intelligence. We become fragile mentally over time. It seems to be not just biology, brain degradation. It seems to be a fundamental feature of complex systems. So I guess that, in fact, emulations will experience becoming inflexible over time. So they have a limited career length after which they must retire. They might retire to an indefinite retirement, but they still will then have to be replaced by younger versions of themselves. So they continually make new copies of the very first version and train it in slightly new ways. So emulations would see around them younger and older versions of themselves that have a very good idea what their future looks like, their future career, their future spouse, etc., because there are these slightly older versions of them around and younger versions as well. So this is you again. You start and you end. Now this could be a diagram describing you if At the beginning of a party, you took a drug which meant that you will not remember that party the next day or ever again. Now, some people have done this sort of thing, they tell me. Not I. Never I. But the question I have for you is, toward the end of that party, will you say to yourself, I'm a whole new creature who's about to die. This is terrible. How did I get myself into this? You could think of yourself that way. You could think the moment you took this drug, you became a new creature, you see, because your future, this other person won't remember you. But most of you probably won't take that attitude, but you could. This is an emulation who splits off a short-term copy who then ends after a short time. It's the same structure, and they could have the same attitudes. Either, I'm a new creature, I'm about to die, this is terrible, I'm going to have a revolution, run away, fight, destroy. Or you could think, this is me, it's the same person, I'm another part of me that I won't later remember. I predict this is the attitude they will have, not because it's the correct attitude, because it gets along in this world. This is a very competitive world. Because it's at subsistence wage and it's really easy to make copies, in this very competitive world, more productive habits are greatly rewarded, i.e. more copies are made of whichever Ems can adopt the more productive habits. And this is one of the more productive habits, being willing to make these short-term copies that then end. There you go. Now, even though you don't mind making a short-term copy that then ends, if you interact with other people around you and they don't know who it is they're talking to, whether you remember other things they said in the past, that gets difficult and awkward. So a simple solution is that they tend to copy together as a team, work together as a team, and then end or retire together as a team. So now each one of them can have predictable social relations with others. Today, it's hard to meet with celebrities. Their time is rare. With Ems, it turns out that anybody can meet easily with celebrities because all they do is spit off another copy that meets with you. The hard thing is to get celebrities to remember you. But we can use this feature in the emulation world to a nice advantage. So today, if you have a leader, say the president, and they say, we must invade Iraq, and you say, why? Why must we invade Iraq? And they say, I can't tell you, state secrets. You're kind of stuck. You don't know whether to believe them. For emulations, they can do the following trick. The president makes a copy, and you make a copy, and both go inside a safe. And inside the safe, they can explain all their reasons to you. And then at the end, you send out one bit. Was I persuaded or not? And then the entire safe is erased. And now you can become persuaded of things, but you don't know why. Yes, in the back. Obviously, you have to trust the structure here. If you trust this structure to be as safe as it claims to be, then you can trust the answer. If it's not what it claims to be, then of course you shouldn't trust it. But that's a generic answer about just about everything you might trust. When it claims to be something, it better be what you think it is, or you're in trouble. Yes. How many different clans will there be? Turns out, I've got a slide in a minute, but so all of the copies that originate from the same original human, let me call that a clan. And now the question might be, how concentrated is the M world in terms of clans? So there are 7 billion potential clans, i.e. all the 7 billion humans. A very equal world would have roughly the same number of Ems per human, i.e. all the clans are roughly the very same size. A very unequal world would be the entire M world all comes from copies of one human. All trillion of them are one. So my prediction is that roughly most emulations come from the few hundred most copied clans. So that's a high degree of inequality relative to our world, but not total inequality. The basis for that is basically looking at the variety of jobs and saying it doesn't seem to be more than a few thousand distinct kinds of job skills and making the prediction there. So basically a few hundred is my best guess. So I told you that I would tell you about humans. So it turns out most of the emulations are concentrated in a small number of dense cities. And so humans can have most of the rest of the Earth, but they don't get to, the emulation cities are kind of hostile to them, so they stay away. Humans basically have to retire. Now, i.e. pretty soon, very quickly, humans lose their ability to compete for wages, i.e. the wages they could earn couldn't make them subsist. However, humans start out owning this entire economy. And so if the economy doubles every month, their wealth doubles every month. So collectively, humans are doing very well. They can have a very rich, comfortable retirement. Since this era only lasts a year or two, there's not that much cultural change for the humans. The main thing that happens, they suddenly lose all their jobs and have to retire, and then collectively they get rich. Now, whether any one human has enough to survive depends on how well humans share and insure. And my confident prediction is, since that has varied enormously across history, it'll vary again. Some places they'll do well, and some places they won't.
question.
The question is, how do Ems get paid and how do they want to get paid? Why do they want to get paid? So this is a subsistence economy. We have seen subsistence economy through history. Actually, our era is the unusual case. Malthusian subsistence world is basically the world of pretty much all animals who've ever lived and all humans who have ever lived in the forager and farmer eras. In a subsistence economy, most work is producing the minimum required to subsist. So 1,000 years ago in a subsistence farming village, most work was done to create food, clothes, shelter, transport the things around. That's where most of their effort went. This is a subsistence economy. Emulations to subsist need computers, energy, cooling, structural support, communication lines, things like that. So most of their work goes to produce those things. And because it's a subsistence economy, they have to work hard most of the time to earn just enough to subsist. So why do they work? Because if they don't exist. Which is pretty much why all humans ever worked through history.
Who created those rules for the Ems in this scenario?
This is not rules. This is applying economics. So standard economics applies to ancient farming societies or the future. And so it's a fact of the world that because there's so much labor, the marginal product of labor has fallen to a very low level, which means wages are low and not much higher than subsistence, which means they have to work to survive. There's not a rule, it's not a political ruling or a decision, it's just the fact of the world. There's plenty of labor and it's hard to exist. It's a economy of poverty, if you like, in a certain sense, but not necessarily slavery.
If the Ems don't work, do we turn them off?
1,000 years ago, if you did not work to farm, you died. There was no rule, there was no ruling, nobody had to tell you that or decide it for you. It's just physics. You don't have enough to buy your basic subsistence, you don't exist. So it's not a rule.
So physics would turn off the computers.
For example, the computers will sit in large racks of computer hardware, and you'll have to rent space on them, and if you can't pay your rental fee, you'll be evicted. So the question is, what does the pie chart of the economy look like? Where is most of the effort happening? So first of all, at one level, most jobs are still going to be office jobs. That's the nature of a complicated economy like ours. So most of them are working in offices in terms of the jobs they're doing. But in terms of the industries are mainly producing computer hardware, cooling, energy, structural support, real estate, communication, the minimum required to exist. That's where most of the money is going. But of course, there's innovation in those things. There's marketing. There's all sorts of things that happen in an advanced economy to support all those things. So there's still a large, complicated economy with large, complicated firms and layers of middle management and all those things. But yes, the question is, how do we know economics works anywhere besides a few miles around this building? Or a few years around our current era? Isn't this all just curve fitting in the actual world we live in, and so it doesn't apply to much of anything else? Now, so first of all, I'd say, no, economics is a robust, general field of knowledge that applies not just around here, it applies over the entire globe. We have decent economic models of a great many very different societies today. We have economic history, which applies standard economics to eras quite differently in the past. Thousands, tens of thousands of years ago, economists studied those sorts of things, and we have an integrated social science where we understand a great many things besides the world we now live in. And so if social science exists, as I said, then it exists at a degree of generality such that we can start to talk about. Now, of course, we'll probably make some mistakes, but if you were applying chemistry or computer science or other things to the future, you'd also make some mistakes. Yes?
So if you're saying that humans would retire into relative richness, then who would be creating the food and items that these humans need? It's almost all food.
The emulations. So humans become the rich capitalists of this world, at least some of them. And so with their capital, they can spend it to acquire things they want from the emulations. So some of the emulations spend their time doing whatever it is the humans want. Sweeping their floors, growing their food, etc., because the rich capitalists have money to spend. The question is, when you have a few rich capitalists and lots of poorer people, doesn't that mean revolution unless something better happens? And no, it doesn't, actually. Historically, we have a vast history of ancient societies, and revolution was really rare in ancient societies. Revolution isn't actually that much correlated with people being unhappy, per se. in terms of objective wealth. Often revolutions actually have happened when people were getting richer and then got more ambitious what they wanted. So revolution is certainly a possibility, but it isn't necessarily derived from the fact of a subsistence economy because, again, we have a long history of thousands of years of subsistence farming economies where revolutions were quite rare. When there was famine, of course, there was often a social breakdown, and whether you want to call that revolution, there was often a lot of rioting and things like that when there was famine. And so that was often a reason why governments made sure to save up food against famine. But revolution is hardly inevitable. Nevertheless, you could ask, why won't they revolt? And the question is, what can you do? I mean, again, in societies where there is a high degree of, there's a few rich people against a lot of poor people, sometimes there's a thing you could do to revolt, and sometimes there just isn't.
I think another reason not to expect a revolution, if I was in this world, I'd probably get myself copied, have one copy of myself, take all my vast amounts of capital, and spend it enjoying myself in the virtual world. And so there'd be a handful of Ems like me, for whom there are only a very few copies, and who spend all their money on these few copies. And then there'd be a small number of people who went, I fancy a life where there are millions of copies of me, and I can get all this money collectively for the clan. And so nearly everybody will be copies of these few people who are basically okay with this way of doing things.
So I have some slides later on inequality, but there's two very different kinds of inequality in this world. Humans versus Ems, humans are individually very rich. So there's these definite humans as the rich capitalists. And so humans are vulnerable there in many ways. Among the Ems, rich clans are ones who have more copies, but individually they don't have higher income. So successful clans. So in our world, we've had often envy of rich families within a nation, but we don't usually envy them for the number of descendants they've had relative to some ancestors. We usually envy them for their individual income or wealth. And in this world, the successful Ems don't necessarily have higher individual income. What they have is a larger success of having more copies, and that's not something we actually usually very envious about in our world. Yes?
In your model, do the Ems have bodies?
I'd say, I'm guessing roughly 20% of jobs need a direct physical representation to do the job. Drivers, factory managers, miners, things like that. Say again?
Farmers?
Farmers. So for emulations who are directly dealing with the physical world, they will need a body, and it will need to be a body appropriate for that job. Now, we already know that, say, when somebody drives a steam shovel, they drive it in a mental mode where they see that steam shovel as part of their body. So we know we are capable of dealing with a wide range of bodies as something we're acting through. But still, they would have whatever bodies are appropriate for the job. But once the workday is over, most likely they spend their leisure time in virtual reality. It's just much nicer. And the people who have desk jobs, they're pretty much going to be in virtual reality too during their desk jobs. Question in the far back.
Yeah, it seems like you look.
During the farming era, from roughly 7,000 years ago until 200 years ago, most people lived near subsistence level, even when there was lots of trade. The Industrial Revolution has been able to produce wealth so fast that it can grow faster than the population, which is why we have increasing wealth or income per person today. That's because we can grow wealth faster, but it's also fundamentally because we don't grow people faster. You can grow the Ems really fast. So even if wealth can grow much faster than our world, since you can grow the Ems even faster, the wealth per M still falls, the income per M still falls, even though they have lots of trade and they're collectively a very rich, productive society. The question is, are we copying the entire brain when we emulate, or just a part of it, so that are we getting emotions coming along? And yes, the answer is, the simple assumption at the beginning is it's just a black box. We copy it entirely. It has all of the features the original has. We don't get to pick and choose. And so yes, it has all of the emotions and all of the mental styles, creativity, getting mad, everything, falling in love. So all of those things are in the emulation. They have all of those desires and habits and styles, which is why we can reason about it. It makes it a scenario of the future that it is easier to reason about exactly because of that. Humans retire basically, and whether they do well depends on how well they share. All emulations started out from humans, and so they're within the range of human mental styles, but they are not typical humans. So if we think of, say, hardworking and smart as characteristics, the red dots are the people, and the dots up above the line are the emulations, i.e. they're selected for being the best on a lot of characteristics, which again, I estimate roughly a few hundred humans, copies of them dominate this whole world. That makes emulations, the typical emulation, is as elite compared to the typical human as the typical Nobel Prize winner, head of state, billionaire, Olympic gold medalist, that sort of thing. They're all that good. We know a lot of things about how more productive people vary in our society, so I just use those to predict. On average, emulations will be smart, conscientious, hardworking, workaholic, get up early in the morning. They'll be near a peak age of productivity. Today, for us, it's about 40 or 50. For them, it might be a century. But whatever it is, most of them are near a peak subjective age. Probably also, on average, be married, religious, because that correlates with productivity today. Emulations, when they're in virtual reality, they never need to feel pain or hunger or grime or disease. Their bodies are always beautiful. It's very cheap to give them luxurious surroundings compared to just the cost of running their brain. So they have beautiful, luxurious worlds, but these are desks. They're working most of the time. But when they have free time, they can have spectacular virtual reality. And the economy is large enough to really develop fantastic stories, music, art, things like that. Some of you, when you were kids, saw the people around you weren't like you, and you thought, maybe I'm an alien from some other planet, and someday I'll meet the people from my planet, and then I'll find people who are like me. This is literally true for the emulations, because they all come from a clan of people very much like them, who all originated from the same human. Probably most work teams won't have that many copies from the same clan, but each of them will be able to consult with this clan to give them on-the-site advice about things and to compare their lives with many others to tell them about things. So they will have this new unit of social organization that will be used for finance and politics and law. And it's a very tempting unit because you have more in common with this than you might with an identical twin. They are that close. The most traumatic thing I think ever happened to humans was the transition from foraging to farming. Foragers were well in tune with their environment. Their mental habits and their styles and what came natural to them fit well with the world they lived in. When farming became possible, it required people adopt somewhat alien mental styles and behaviors. They no longer forage, they stay in one place. They now have war, they now have marriage, they now have property and more inequality. And this was hard to get people to accept, but humans have enough cultural plasticity to create religions and conformity pressures such as those were able to make humans become farmers. And this distinction between the forager lifestyle and mental style and the farmer lifestyle actually maps somewhat plausibly onto a roughly liberal conservative dimension in our society today. And so, originally, say, foragers were relatively liberal, conservative farmers are relatively conservative. In the last few hundred years, as we've gotten rich, plausibly what's happened is the pressures that make farmers into farmers feel less compelling, and we've drifted more toward liberal or forager mental styles or habits. We've become we're more horrified by slavery. We're more into democracy, into leisure, more into promiscuity, more into art, travel. These are forager styles. And so many people are proud of this, and they hope or see the future continuing in this direction as we get individually richer. My prediction here, though, is that while for the humans this continues to be true, for the Ems it's not, because they go back to a subsistence income level and a poor world where the culture does need to apply pressure to get them to act in ways that seem strange. The farmer-like cultural pressures, the conservative pressures, will have a resurgence because they have a need for it. This is your life. You train and then you work and then you retire. 3 main phases of your life. Emulations have those same phases, but it's emphasized work. So they can have a small number of copies who are trained and then make many copies of those to work, so they can lavish a lot of expense on very high quality training. And then when they retire, they can retire at a slower speed. So there's roughly a linear relationship between speed and cost. So if you want an emulation that runs twice as fast, it'll cost you twice as much per minute. So it has about the same cost per subjective minute. This means if you're not rich when you retire, it's not a problem, you just retire slow. And now the world speeds up around you, and now humans and retirees have a common cause in wanting the civilization to be stable, because otherwise it doesn't last, for them at least. If you want a long, stable retirement and you're slow, you need the civilization to last a very long time relative to the speed of those things. Yes?
Is that keeping a process in memory, if it's not running, can actually be pretty expensive.
Absolutely. So actually, this linear range over which you can run twice as fast and it costs twice as much The high end of that range is set roughly at the fastest device speeds, but the low end of that range is set by roughly the ratio of the cost of just an archived copy versus the cost of running a human speed copy. I estimate that to be roughly 1 billion. So you could probably go down to 1 billion times slower than human speed before you run into these two costs being about the same. So at human speed, the cost of running a human versus archiving that copy is roughly a factor of 1 billion, which means you can easily spin off archive copies every few minutes at a relatively low cost, at least if you're putting them in very low cost archive memory. That's my rough estimate. They can have a huge range of motivations. The world is just defined by the people who have both the ability and the motivation such that they do the things the world needs. So the question, if motivation is a high constraint, then there'll be a trade-off between ability and motivation. The emulations are those who are not only able to function well in this emulation world, they're the ones who have a motivation such that they do function in the emulation world, i.e. they show up for work, they do their job, they're willing to split off spur copies, et cetera. They do the things this world needs. I already know many people who are very capable, people who are workaholics, and I think who would do fine in this world, so I don't see it as a problem. I see lots of candidates, people who would be happy to try to succeed in this world.
If we have these 100 copies who work very efficiently, generate a lot of wealth, after some time, how do we replace them? Because if they work so efficiently and people just have everything they need, why should they work? It should think about getting better, because there are a lot of people in now real world, this current world, which actually become better, become the best, just because there are a lot of competition.
So the question is,
use the mic.
Right. Why do they work if they're so productive? If they're so productive, don't they make so much that they don't need to work anymore because they are so very good? 1,000 years ago, subsistence human farmers were a pinnacle of productivity relative to the rest of the animal world. Nevertheless, they were still living at a subsistence level. So pretty much all animals who have ever lived have lived at a subsistence level, even though most of them go extinct. So the few who continue to remain are at a pinnacle of productivity relative to the others who go extinct. Nevertheless, in a typical animal world, most of them are living at subsistence level, and that's been true for most of human history. So it's quite possible for there to be a world of the most productive and have them still be living at a subsistence level because there are so many of them relative to the environment resources. So a very large population of very productive people can still have a low income because the marginal productivity is low because there are so many.
Does this not assume a zero-sum game? I mean, Ems could stop creating so many copies of them such that the few that remain live very comfortably, in the same way that we no longer have to work 16-hour days, we only work 8.
That was been true through the entire farming era. Through all 10,000 years of the farming era, if only people could get together and agree not to have so many kids, then a few generations later, they could all live more comfortably. Right after the Black Death, that's exactly what did happen in Europe. The Black Death showed up, half the population died off, and for the next few generations, people lived pretty well because there was the same amount of land and other capital, a lot fewer workers, wages went up. But within a few generations, they did not make that coordination, they did not prevent the population from rising, and so wages fell back to subsistence level within a century of the Black Death in 1350.
So in this world, how are humans getting access to any percentage of the wealth generated by the Ems?
So in our world, we have retirees. Retirees don't work for the rest of us. They're sponging off the rest of us. They're parasites. We could say to ourselves, let's go kill all the retirees and take their stuff. What are they doing for us? But we don't. We, so far, mostly let retirees continue to exist, spending their income that they earned earlier, and humans can hope that that happens to them. Humans can hope to be the retirees of the emulation world. Now, there's a better chance for that if they are integrated. So part of the reason we don't kill all the retirees and take their stuff is that they are integrated into our financial and legal and political systems such that trying to do this would threaten the stability of these systems we share. Similarly, if Ems share institutions with humans, they might be reluctant to try to kill all the humans and take their stuff because that would threaten the peace among themselves. As a perhaps hope that the more they would end up having different institutions, different things they use between themselves than they use with humans, the more possibility there would be to just cut off the humans. If all the retirees in our world went off to some island, then we can more plausibly say, let's just cut off that island. Because they would be in a separate world with separate supports.
So like Monsanto, when they release GMO seeds, they're often designed to be sterile so they can't reproduce. So you have to buy more GMO seeds from the agricultural factory. Why wouldn't the M factories make sure that the M's can't copy themselves and wouldn't want to copy themselves? So you have to go back to the factory and pay a licensing fee to get a new one to keep the population down.
If at the beginning of the emulation era, the original developer of emulation technology was a small unitary organization that was able to maintain a lock on its technology, it might well try to play a monopolist of that technology and prevent others from using the technology and always pay that firm a big fee to do it. And that might happen in the early era. I just can't see that lasting that long. So in this scenario, I assumed it was a competitively available technology. It was available to many different parties. And so I find it hard to imagine that even if that starts out in that scenario of a monopolist holding on to it, that could last throughout this entire era. But that's my guess.
Do you see the M's choosing to make copies of themselves, or is it the capitalist that controls them, the one that chooses how many copies are made of each clan, you said?
Imagine it's this way. You are in emulation, you have a job, you're doing your job, you're doing pretty well, and now there's a new place somewhere else over there where a job like yours is needed. Somebody like you over there is needed. Now, I could be eager and say, I really want to make another copy of myself. I'm searching out for it, and whenever it shows up, I try to make a bid for it, like go to some capitalists and say, hey, would you fund some capital so that I can make a new venture copy of myself over there because, hey, I'm really eager to make copies. Or you might not be so eager. You might just be doing your job, and a capitalist see this opportunity over there. They say, this guy would be good at that. And he comes to you and says, I got a deal for you. How about we make another copy for you, and here are the terms. This is the income you'll get over there. This is the capital you accumulate. Here are the rights you will have. Here's how the first copy won't compete with you, et cetera. There'll be many ways that the terms of these contracts could be proposed. The economics doesn't really matter that much who makes the initial proposal. The economics mostly determines what are the efficient contracts that end up being offered, and the main thing required is that there ends up being a job that's available and that you're willing to do it at some reasonable terms, if not use somebody. And the prediction is, as long as there are some people who are willing enough to make copies of themselves where, hey, it's another job, it looks like a life worth living, I'm going to make another copy of myself with a life worth living, I'm okay with that. As long as there are some people like that, this all goes through, and it doesn't that much matter what their motivations are. The main thing is that they choose to do it. Emulations go fast or slow. So how fast any one worker goes depends on how fast is optimal for that job. So those that interact with humans will go as slow as humans. Those of them might be in a race, you might go fast. Bosses will turn out to go faster. Leisure probably goes faster. If you're a fast emulation, then the world around you is solid mountains. Very few things change. There's only a few tunnels that you can go in and use. If you're very slow emulations, however, the opposite is true. Everything around you is fast and buzzing, and you better keep your fingers out or they'll get bitten off. So fast and slow emulations, even though they are identical in the software-wise, they really live in quite different worlds. In the emulations who interact with humans, if they have a body, it would probably be human size because that's natural. But if you run faster, what you need is a proportionally shorter body so that you can have a natural reaction to the body. There's a basic physics relation there. So as they get faster and faster, plausibly it can go up to 1 million times human speed. They would have smaller and smaller bodies. At some point, they might teleoperate them rather than fit the brain in the body. You might notice that they'll clump into speed classes rather than just being spread uniformly across things. Just like we clump into cities, they will clump into classes of speed so that they can interact with each other. And this becomes a class hierarchy because these faster emulations are high status in many obvious ways. They embody more wealth, they win arguments, they know things first, meetings happen in their place. So speed is high class. You can also go much slower, and most retirees would be slower, and there ends up being a whole hierarchy, and in a sense, these emulations become ghost-like. That is, like our traditional ghosts of literature, slow retiree emulations are not up with things, they're not paying attention, they're not really very valuable to talk to, they're kind of obsessed with the past. They can't have much influence, but if you want to talk to one, there's thousands, millions of them around available to talk to if you so desire. As I said, our cities are limited by, they're great in some ways, but the major limitation is traffic congestion. That's why we aren't all in one big city. That's no longer true for emulations. Because they can interact across the city in virtual reality without actually sending themselves, they can have larger cities that function well. And so they would concentrate into a small number of dense cities. We have fractal infrastructure. And my last slide, which is today, in virtual reality, you can interact with anybody across the entire world because the speed of light to get a signal to them is less than your reaction time of 1/10 of a second. For an emulation that's 16 times faster, that needs to be within 1,000 kilometers. If they're even faster still, it needs to be, let's just say they're within, they need to be with 256 times faster. They need to be within a few tens of kilometers. And so the faster emulations go, the harder it is for them to interact with other emulations without noticing the delay. So that's a reason not to go too fast. A reason not to go too slow, however, is that you want your career to last within roughly a doubling time of the economy. Otherwise, your initial job skills are no longer relevant quickly into your career. And that sets a upper limit, a limit how slow you might want to go. And those two things together give me an estimate of roughly 1,000 times human speed for the typical speed of the emulation. And I have other things to say about emulation inequality, but I will, since it's the end, leave you with these are some positives and negatives. I caution you that if your ancestors were evaluating your world, they would love things and hate other things, and perhaps whether they liked you or not would depend on the first thing they heard. You should think carefully about a whole different civilization you don't know much about before you decide if you love it or hate it. But these are some things to notice. In virtual reality, again, no pain, hunger, grit, whatever. They're not afraid of death. Some of you may be in a city like this area and you think I couldn't possibly live in a small town because nothing's going on there. They will think that about your cities because they will have much bigger, more intricate cities with a lot more going on. On the negative, they are working at subsistence income, long hours. There's more inequality in this world. Often they are OK with these spurs that end. Bigger, more bureaucratic firms, perhaps less nature and space travel, less democracy, more religion. This is the age of M, as I best guessed it. Again, it's not my job to make you like it or hate it. My job is just to tell you, as best I can, what it looks like.
On your website, Overcoming Bias, you speak frequently to behavioral biases and how they affect people's understandings of the future. How do you control for these in your own research?
One bias is a taboo on assuming that we fail. So my colleague Tyler Cowen wrote a book about inequality a few years ago, where he basically assumed that inequality was going to get worse, and he said, how can you deal with this? And a lot of people just didn't like that, because they said, hey, we think inequality is a problem, and you're assuming we're going to fail. And he said, yeah. And so similarly, here many people think that this is a scenario where we fail at some things we would like to change, and I'm saying, yeah. So I think you should just consider scenarios where we fail at achieving some of the ideals we have. There's another cognitive phenomena called construal level theory, which says that we have an abstract way of reasoning and a concrete way of reasoning. And they have different features. Our abstract reasoning is more creative and intuitive. Our concrete reasoning is more detail-oriented and based on analysis and things like that. We are prone to reason abstractly about the future because we have so few concrete details to anchor us, and so there's a risk of becoming too abstract about the future. Our abstract mode also makes us very principled in the sense that in abstract mode, we think of small number of moral principles should hold very strongly with few exceptions. And we think that of all theories, whereas in concrete mode, we are more willing to admit there's a lot of complexity and to give people a pass on various exceptions and things like that. And so that's also a thing to be wary about the future. Because it's so abstract, you decide that there are these moral principles that simply must be held. Those are some examples there. Do I believe whole brain emulation is the most likely path to reach superintelligence? And who are the biggest players? So in terms of players, there are 3 technologies I told you about. None of them are ready yet, so nobody putting them together, nor should they. It's way too early for that. But in the 3 technologies, there are, of course, many players in computers, scanning, and in brain cell modeling. I have opinions about the most likely paths, but my book was primarily not about that question. So just to be clear, the future is important enough that, say, we should be exploring 100 different scenarios. That means we should explore a scenario with only a 1% chance. So I think this definitely reaches that standard of at least a 1% chance. So I think we should take each scenario that has at least a 1% chance and work it out like I've worked out here. And that's what this book about. The book is showing expertise in being able to work out a scenario. I did argue a little bit about why it's not unlikely, but that wasn't the focus of the book. As I said, the other most plausible route to artificial intelligence is slowly accumulating better software, as we've been doing for a long time. We have, at the rate of progress there, it looks roughly 2 to 4 centuries. the rough guesses about the rate of progress it would take to do brain emulation are roughly a century or so, which is why this seems plausibly the thing that might happen first. But those are pretty weak inferences, so I'm happy to say, hey, there's a lot of possibilities, and I'm not going to argue very strongly for any one calculation there. I know some of the players in brain scanning because there's a brain preservation foundation that I contributed some money to that is trying to develop better ways of scanning brains. There actually are decent scans of mouse brains at a reasonable resolution. We don't know if it's good enough resolution because we don't know how far you have to go. Mouse brain is roughly 1,000th times smaller than a human brain, so in terms of scaling, you have to go up by a factor of 1,000 still. But my guess is brain scanning is the first technology to be ready.
Everything I've heard so far, you've been talking about adults and how they would work in this. I wonder if you scanned a young child and let them grow up in this environment, if they would rapidly outcompete adults who are sort of transplanted into this environment. And if so, would that shorten the doubling time and the duration of this economy?
It is my guess that, in fact, very quickly, scanning children will be the preference of this society. So at the very beginning, you would be taking people at the current peak of their human career and copying them, the best software engineer, the best lawyer, et cetera. But very quickly, as this world changes, the people who are best in the human world will no longer be the best in this new world. You'll need people who are younger and flexible to learn and adapt to this world, and therefore you want to pick young children. Now, there's a substantial complication here, which is that the first scans will probably be destructive. So you would then have the scenario of rich capitalists, humans and Ems otherwise, approaching families of children who seem to have a lot of potential to be successful in the emulation world, saying, could we destructively scan your child so that they have a chance of becoming a very successful emulation? The obvious prediction is some places will allow that and some won't. And wherever it's allowed, that will dominate the emulation economy. So my straightforward prediction is yes, is that there are many obstacles by which an emulation economy will face resistance in the pre-existing economy. But that happened in the industrial era and the farming transitions as well. There were some long transitions in part because of these obstacles being overcome. But by the time this economy is doubling every month, those obstacles will have been overcome somewhere. And so somewhere they will allow destructive scanning of children. And that'll happen somewhere. That's just prediction on the basis of wherever it happens, it'll happen somewhere. Wherever it happens, they'll have a big advantage. So that's it. In the back.
Where does all the energy come from for this constant doubling of Ems? Are they somehow like extremely more efficient than current people are energy-wise, or?
So I don't know how fast this economy can grow its energy budget, but even if it's very limited in its ability to grow the energy budget, it can still just make its computers more miniaturized and use less energy. Also, within a few decades, we will need to switch to what's called reversible computing, thermodynamically reversible. And with thermodynamically reversible computing parts, you have a trade-off that you can run it twice as slow and use only half as much energy per computation. So as energy gets more expensive, they will just be pushed to move in that regime towards slower computational cycles, but you can compensate with more hardware. So the age of M, growing fast and being big, isn't very sensitive to how cheap energy is. Even if energy is very expensive, this all can still happen. But I would guess they would be so eager to get more energy, they would spend a lot. So one of the things I can tell you is that when you're using reversible computing hardware and other reversible systems in general, you spend roughly half of your budget on the hardware and half on the energy and cooling. So emulation cities are roughly half the volume as cooling pipes, full of ice water coming in and steam coming out because it's so valuable to spend more on it, because that's real estate-wise, you're spending half your budget on that. So, and so energy is a big fraction of this economy, i.e. you'll spend roughly half of your budget on energy and cooling relative to building more hardware. So they're spending a lot on it, and therefore innovation in it will be very valuable. And we do really know a lot of futuristic sounding ways to increase the energy budget. It's actually harder to find futuristic ways to make cooling faster. So that's why I think cooling is actually a bigger limitation than energy. The key argument for subsistence level is that no matter how fast you figure out that you could innovate this economy, you can just crank more computers out of the factories faster. So as long as you can just keep cranking computers out of the factories faster and the other resources they need faster than the economy can innovate, then the wealth or income per M falls down to subsistence level. That's the key argument. So it's about the relative speeds. So even if innovation is very fast, as long as production is even faster, production wins.
One thing we didn't have time for is how they interact with each other. So how do you predict they interact with each other emotionally and family-wise, clan-wise?
So the book has a lot of detail about interactions. If you look at the sections, early on there's the basic setup, and then there's some physics and some other things. But then we do organizations and sociology, and also there's whole big sections on that. So I talk a lot about work and how they organize at work, and they will be in big firms like we do, but there'll be some difference because they have these clan structure. They will have, I predict, the usual sort of romantic attachments and inclinations in that direction. The main complication there is that there's no longer necessarily an equal demand for male versus female work. So plausibly there's a asymmetric ratio there that they have to deal with, and I talk about some of the ways they could deal with that. There are the ways in which, so if you're in a team, you're going to be copied together as a team. Today when you have a team, you have to worry if some of your team members are going to leave your team, betraying your team and going somewhere else, but that happens, right? Ems, they don't have to worry about that. If one of your team member leaves, a copy leaves, the original stays with your team. So the teams stay together for life. So teams are a very strong social bond. You can copy a whole team. So if you have a team around you, there's probably thousands or even millions of other copies of that team out there that you can use as statistics about your team. So if I have a relationship with Bob, or say Sue, I'm married to Sue, and out there all of a sudden Bob's and Stu start having fights and getting divorced, I know that my relationship may be in trouble because there's all these other copies of my relationship out there to use as data points. So, and because these other copies of me around me create not only can I talk to other members of my clan as sources of information, I have to worry that things I do will be taken as information about other copies of me. And that creates more of an incentive for me to behave because otherwise, if he starts acting weird, maybe the other ones will act weird too. So there's a whole bunch of things like that that the book talks about.
So we were already talking about political structures and about power and revolution. I'm just curious, sort of how do you use social science to think about that sort of stuff?
The question is about politics, so there are chapters and sections on politics. First thing is to say is that autocrats relative to democracies have some relative advantages here. That doesn't mean democracy disappears, but the proportion shifts. So autocrats here, again, we have the safes that can help you trust a leader, an autocratic leader, via the safes I talked about. Also, today, autocrats have the problem that the few people around them, they need strong loyalty from them, and they have to be afraid of betrayal about the few people around them. Ems can just have copies of themselves around them as the leader. Leaders can run much faster here, so you can have very fast leaders, and that allows bosses in general to have more advantages. So hierarchies here are probably shorter because the bosses can have larger spans of control. Those are some of the things to say about politics here. One person, one M1 vote just doesn't work here. Perhaps speed-weighted voting does work, which of course gives the government an excuse or a reason to monitor everybody's speed all the time, so that they can weight them appropriately in the election.
It looks like you thought through this scenario of the future in great details. I'm very curious about your thinking process. How did you get to this point where, I think you managed to answer most of our questions in so many details. And which I think is better than most people I heard.
So, as I indicated earlier, I have spent a lifetime learning many different fields. Academia doesn't usually reward that, so I kind of squeaked by in getting tenure. But I started out in engineering, then I moved to physics, I did philosophy, then I did 9 years of computer research, then I went back and did political science and economics, and I've read a lot. So basically, I'm not doing anything very special other than having a lifetime of learning many fields and then just straightforwardly applying the things I know about all these fields. So I would claim that if you look at the section of my book about the field you know a lot about, you will find it to be a relatively straightforward application of things you know. Maybe you wouldn't have thought of those applications per se, but they are straightforward, and that's my claim here. I'm just knowing a lot of different fields and just methodically going through each one and saying, what is the standard results about this field say about this scenario?
Quick question, follow-up question. Do you get a lot of feedback, in person from people, or it mainly happens as a research where you're alone in the room?
This is where I get feedback. When I give talks, you people talk to me. Writing a book is lonely, by the way, especially if it's a weird book that nobody ever writes a book like about before. So if you write a book like somebody else's book, then you can send them a copy of your draft and they'll send you a copy and tell you what they thought. If you're writing a weird book that's like no other book, then you're all on your own. So writing the book itself is lonely. Publishing it is less lonely when you get people to talk to you about the book like this. So I'm enjoying this. In order to reach the age of M, society will inevitably experience serious economic growing pains. In what ways does society have to change in order to make the introduction of powerful automation technology positive for the majority of the population? I think subsistence economies are okay. That is, I think most humans through history had okay lives. They were lives worth living. So most foragers in the woods, most farmers, subsistence farmers, sometimes there were famines, sometimes there were invasions, then things didn't go so well. But mostly, humans evolved to exist as subsistence income worlds, and that's where most humans ever did exist, and those lives were okay. So I think a future of subsistence is an okay world. So in that sense, it's positive because there's probably less war here. There's more, again, no grime, disease, pain. There's some other nice positives here. So I already think this is reasonably positive, but there's obviously always a lot of opportunities for making things better. But I have to tell you that when people talk about the future, they seem to me overwhelmingly tempted to evaluate and discuss whether they like things or not before they've even done the very basics of analysis. So I feel the thing I can contribute is to get people to pause longer and do more analysis before they jump into evaluation mode, because I have no doubt they will get to evaluation mode. I do not feel any need to jump in and offer my first evaluation so as to decide what they should evaluate. Evaluate on your own terms. You figure out how you evaluate. But first, please pause and think about the actual world you're talking about. See it in some detail. Learn a few things about it before you jump in and evaluate. And then once you do some evaluation, maybe you can think about what you like and you don't like, and we can think about ways to push it in the directions you like. It's not so hard. The hard thing is to get this baseline estimate of what the world looks like. If you don't have the foggiest idea what a world looks like, you jump in to try to fix it, that just doesn't go well.
So you mentioned Ems making decisions and signing contracts. So would they need some sort of secure execution environment in order to do that? So what would prevent something else from manipulating their emulation software to make them make decisions that they wouldn't normally make?
All of human and animal history has involved people making decisions in contexts where things they rely on are usually, but not always, reliable. That includes pretty much all human history making contacts and demons, and pretty much all of human history, people have tried to persuade each other to be favorable in ways that are fair and unfair. I just predict that all continues here. They will continue to use mildly unreliable, but mostly reliable mechanisms as we have, with some improvements, to make whatever deals they can. And yes, they will try to influence and persuade each other in licit and illicit ways. That just seems like an easy prediction to me. How could it be otherwise?